In the vast, untamed wilderness of northern Montana, where the mountains rise like silent sentinels and the forests stretch endlessly into the horizon, life is both a gift and a challenge. The air is thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the landscape is rugged, filled with towering trees, rushing streams, and rocky outcrops that stand as timeless markers of the land's strength. The weather here can shift at a moment's notice, with harsh winters that blanket the ground in snow and summers that bring a fleeting warmth. In this unforgiving environment, where nature rules with unrelenting force, life and death are never far apart. Every animal, every plant, and every human must adapt or succumb to the elements that shape this wild world. It is a place where survival requires resilience, and where the peace that can be found is often hard-earned. In this wilderness, there lived a young girl named Lily. She was 10 years old. With a spirit that seemed to echo the wildness around her, Lily's family had made their home in a small cabin on the edge of the forest. A place where the trees stood tall and the wind whispered through the branches like an old secret. Lily had always felt a deep connection to the land and its creatures. From a young age, she had been fascinated by the animals that roamed the woods, the deer, the foxes, the bears, and even the elusive mountain lions. Her bond with the natural world was special, almost as if she could communicate with the animals in a way that others could not. She would often spend hours outside, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched a bird take flight or a squirrel scamper up a tree. The animals, in turn, seemed to watch her with the same curiosity, as if they, too, sensed that she was different. Lily's family had moved to the cabin after a time of great loss. Her mother, Sarah, was a kind-hearted and compassionate woman, a veterinarian by trade, who had always cared for animals with a tenderness that reflected her deep understanding of the fragile balance of life. After the death of Lily's older brother, Jack, who had passed away from cancer, Sarah had suggested that the family leave their old life behind and move to this remote corner of Montana. She believed that the peace of the wilderness would help them heal, allowing them to find solace in the beauty of the natural world. Sarah's decision to move to the woods was not just for her own healing, but for the healing of the entire family. The loss of Jack had cast a shadow over their lives, and Sarah hoped that by immersing themselves in the rhythms of nature, they could begin to rebuild their lives in a way that would honor Jack's memory without being consumed by grief. Lily's father, Thomas, was once a skilled hunter, a man whose life had been defined by his work in the woods. He had spent years tracking game through the forests and hills, understanding the delicate balance between predator and prey. But after Jack's death, Thomas had struggled with his own grief, as well as a growing realization that his past work as a hunter no longer brought him the satisfaction it once had. The loss of his son had forced him to question everything, including his place in the world. In search of a new direction, he had taken up wildlife photography, a career that allowed him to continue spending time in the forest. But this time with a camera in hand instead of a rifle. It was a new way of seeing the world, one that required patience and an appreciation for the quiet moments of beauty that often went unnoticed. Through his lens, Thomas began to reconnect with the wilderness in a way that was different from the hunting he had known. He found peace in capturing the fleeting beauty of a sunrise over the mountains or the quiet grace of a deer stepping through the underbrush. Photography, for Thomas, had become a form of healing, a way to honor the life of his son and to find new purpose in the world around him. As a family, they had found their rhythm in the forest. Their small cabin, nestled among the trees, was a refuge from the outside world. The family's life was simple, but it was a life that felt right to them. They lived off the land as much as they could, growing their own vegetables and raising animals for food. They had learned to respect the land and its creatures, understanding that their survival was tied to the health of the forest. Sarah's work as a veterinarian allowed her to care for both wild animals and domestic pets. And she often found herself tending to injured wildlife that had wandered too close to the edge of civilization. She would help rehabilitate them, nursing them back to health before releasing them back into the wild. Always with a sense of awe for the resilience of nature. Lily, for her part, had become an integral part of the family's connection to the wilderness. She spent her days exploring the woods, observing the animals, and learning from the natural world around her. There was a quiet wisdom in Lily that belied her age. As though she understood things that others might miss. She had an innate respect for the animals, and they seemed to return that respect. She knew when to approach quietly and when to stand still and observe. She could tell when an animal was afraid, when it was hungry, or when it was simply going about its day. The creatures of the forest seemed to accept her presence, never startled or threatened by her. It was as if they sensed the deep connection she had with them. A connection that was born not of dominance but of mutual respect. The family's home was a small oasis in the vastness of the wilderness. A place where time seemed to slow down. There were days when the silence of the forest was overwhelming, when the only sounds were the rustling of the wind in the trees or the distant calls of birds. But it was a peaceful silence, one that allowed for reflection and healing. For Sarah and Thomas, it was a chance to rebuild their lives after Jack's death, to honor his memory while also finding a new way forward. For Lily, it was a chance to grow up in a place where she could learn the true value of life and death, where she could witness firsthand the resilience of nature and the delicate balance that held everything together. Together, the family had found a way to live in harmony with the wildness around them. And in doing so, they had begun to heal. The wilderness, with all its dangers and challenges, had become their home, a place where life and death were always intertwined, and where each day brought new lessons about survival, love, and the fragile beauty of the natural world. One bright, crisp morning, Lily and her parents set out for a long hike through the woods. The sun was peeking through the towering pines, casting long shadows on the ground as they ventured deeper into the forest. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine needles and earth, and the distant calls of birds echoed through the trees. It was a beautiful day, one of those days when the world seemed peaceful and full of promise. The family had often taken these hikes, enjoying the serenity of nature, the way it made him feel connected to the land. But on this particular day, their quiet stroll would soon be interrupted by a dangerous and unexpected encounter. As they walked, Lily's sharp eyes noticed movement in the distance. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shadow flitting between the trees. But then she saw it clearly, a pack of wolves, circling something on the ground. The wolves moved in unison, their sleek bodies weaving through the underbrush with an eerie precision. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she realized what they were circling. Two bear cubs, small and vulnerable, were trapped in the middle of the pack. The cubs were clearly frightened. Huddled together, their wide eyes filled with terror as the wolves closed in. The sight of them, abandoned and defenseless, tugged at Lily's heart. She had always felt a deep connection to the animals of the forest, and seeing these helpless cubs at the mercy of the wolves made her blood run cold. Her parents, seeing the situation unfold, immediately froze, their eyes scanning the scene. They had seen wolves hunt before, had witnessed the ruthless efficiency of a pack on the hunt. But this was different. These cubs were not just another prey animal. They were young, innocent, and clearly in need of help. Sarah, Lily's mother, gripped her husband's arm, her face filled with worry. Thomas, though more accustomed to the harsh realities of the wild, was equally concerned. Both of them understood the danger of intervening in such situations. Wolves were an essential part of the ecosystem, and the balance of nature was delicate. But their hearts ached at the sight of the cubs in such peril. They knew they couldn't just stand there and do nothing. But they also knew they had to be cautious. The wolves were dangerous, and any attempt to intervene could make the situation worse. Lily, however, was not thinking about the risks. Her small hands clenched into fists, and her eyes narrowed with determination. She couldn't just watch these cubs suffer. Despite her age, despite her size, she felt a surge of bravery rise within her. Without a word, she moved forward, stepping carefully through the trees. Her parents tried to stop her, but Lily was already too far ahead. They called her name, their voices filled with concern. But she didn't look back. There was no time to waste. The wolves were closing in, and the cubs had no chance of surviving on their own. Lily knew she had to act quickly. She reached down and grabbed a long, sturdy branch from the ground. It was heavy in her hands, but she was determined. With all her strength, she swung the branch in the air, creating a loud crack that echoed through the forest. The wolves paused for a moment, their ears twitching at the sound. But they didn't retreat. Lily's heart raced as she realized that the noise alone wouldn't be enough to scare him off. She needed to do more. She scanned the ground and saw a pile of rocks nearby. Without hesitating, she picked up several and began hurling them towards the wolves, each one striking the ground with a sharp thud. The wolves, startled by the sudden barrage of noise and rocks, began to back away slightly. But their instinct was strong, and they didn't retreat far. They were used to threats, used to fighting for their food. Lily's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she continued to throw stones and swing the branch, creating as much noise as possible. Her small body trembled with fear, but she stood her ground. She knew the cubs needed her, and she couldn't afford to back down. As Lily continued to act with fierce determination, one of the wolves, a large alpha with piercing yellow eyes, growled menacingly. It was a warning, a sign that the wolves were considering whether to attack. Lily felt a knot of fear in her stomach. She was alone in this, facing a pack of wild predators with nothing but her courage and the objects she had found to defend herself. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't let those cubs become another meal for the pack. Her parents, watching from a distance, were filled with terror for their daughter. They knew Lily had a unique bond with the animals of the forest, but they also knew the danger she was putting herself in. Thomas was about to move forward to stop her, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "She's doing it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's saving them." And Sarah was right. Despite the odds, Lily's actions were working. The wolves, unsure of what to make of this tiny human who wasn't backing down, began to hesitate. The alpha wolf growled once more. But this time, he seemed less certain. The pack was still hungry, still eager, but the noise, the movement, and the sheer unexpectedness of the situation were beginning to wear them down. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the pack began to retreat. They didn't leave immediately, but they backed off slowly, their eyes fixed on Lily and the cubs. The alpha wolf lingered for a moment, staring at her, before turning and signaling to the others. One by one, the wolves slipped into the underbrush, their presence slowly fading into the shadows of the forest. Lily, panting and shaking, stood still for a moment, her eyes locked on the spot where the wolves had been. She felt her heart still pounding in her chest, the adrenaline slowly leaving her body. Her legs were weak, but she didn't let herself collapse. She had done it. She had saved the cubs. Her parents rushed to her side, both filled with relief and astonishment. They knelt down beside her, their hands gently pulling her close. Lily, her mother whispered, "You were so brave." Thomas simply nodded, his eyes filled with admiration for the courage his daughter had shown. The two bear cubs, still frightened but now safe, huddled together nearby, their eyes wide as they watched the humans who had intervened in their fate. For a moment, everything was quiet. The danger had passed, but the forest was still full of life, full of stories that only nature could tell. Lily had acted out of pure instinct, out of a love for the creatures of the wild that ran deeper than words. And in that moment, she knew that she had done the right thing. The wilderness was harsh, unforgiving, but it was also a place of wonder, a place where life could find a way, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Lily stood in the forest, her heart still pounding in her chest as the last of the wolves retreated into the trees. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't let herself stop. The bear cubs, still shaken by the close encounter, remained huddled together on the forest floor, their wide eyes watching Lily with a mix of fear and curiosity. Despite the danger that had just passed, Lily couldn't ignore the tiny creatures before her. They were helpless and alone, abandoned in the wilderness with no way of protecting themselves. It was clear to her that the cubs couldn't survive on their own. At least not without the risk of predators like the wolves. Her parents, standing at a distance and watching their daughter with a mix of awe and concern, knew the decision had to be made quickly. Thomas, Lily's father, had spent many years in the wilderness, hunting, tracking, and studying the creatures of the forest. He had learned to respect the delicate balance of nature, knowing that every action had consequences, and that interfering in the lives of wild animals could have unintended and far-reaching effects. But as he looked at Lily, standing tall and determined, her eyes filled with compassion for the cubs, he felt a surge of pride. His daughter had acted instinctively, driven by a deep connection to the forest and its creatures. He could see that she had done what she felt was right. But now, the responsibility was on him to make sure the cubs' lives weren't in vain. "I don't like it, Sarah," Thomas said softly, his voice edged with concern. "We're stepping into something we don't fully understand. Bringing them back could disrupt their natural instincts." Sarah, Lily's mother, had been quietly assessing the situation from a distance, her veterinary training kicking in as she quickly analyzed the condition of the two cubs. She could see the fear in their eyes, the frailty in their small bodies. She had treated countless animals before, both wild and domestic, but this was different. These were orphaned cubs, left vulnerable to the elements and predators, and in desperate need of care. The situation was far from ideal, but Sarah understood the complexities of wildlife rehabilitation. She had spent years working with animals, and though she knew that interference could lead to complications, she also knew that sometimes an animal's survival depended on human help. "Thomas, we can't leave him out here," Sarah said with quiet resolve. "They'll never make it on their own. At least not without a mother to care for them. We have to take them with us. At least for now. We can't just watch them die." Thomas hesitated. He knew that Sarah was right. Leaving the cubs to fend for themselves would almost certainly lead to their demise. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that their intervention could, at the very least, give the cubs a fighting chance. The wilderness was cruel, and while he respected its power, he also understood that compassion sometimes required action. "All right," Thomas said, after a long pause, "but we need to be careful. We don't know how they'll react to being with us. We have to make sure we don't make things worse." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with what needed to be done. She approached the cubs slowly, kneeling down so that she wouldn't appear threatening. The cubs, though still frightened, seemed to sense that she meant them no harm. They didn't flee, but remained still, their trembling bodies showing the fear they still felt from the attack. Sarah gently reached out, touching the smaller of the two cubs. The cub flinched at first, but then relaxed slightly under her touch. "They're scared, but they're not injured," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady. "We'll need to keep them warm and hydrated, and get them some food. We can't leave them here. And the sooner we get him to the cabin, the better." Lily, standing nearby, watched with wide eyes as her mother assessed the cubs. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. They weren't just going to leave them behind, they were going to help them. Lily had acted out of instinct, driven by a desire to protect these creatures. But now she understood that this wasn't just about saving them from the wolves. It was about giving them a chance at survival in a world that was often too harsh and unforgiving. Together, as a family, they carefully moved the cubs. The cubs were still small, barely old enough to fend for themselves, but they were surprisingly strong for their size. With the cubs wrapped in warm blankets and tucked into the back of their truck, they began the journey back to their cabin. The ride was quiet, with only the sound of the engine breaking the stillness of the forest around them. Lily's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and concern. She had saved these cubs, but now the real work would begin. She couldn't help but wonder if they would ever be able to return to the wild, or if they would always be dependent on her family for care. When they arrived at the cabin, Sarah immediately got to work. She set up a small space for the cubs in the living room, where they could rest and recover. She made sure they had plenty of water and carefully prepared some food for them. Small pieces of meat and fruit that would help them regain their strength. Thomas, meanwhile, worked on gathering supplies, preparing the cabin for the unexpected addition to their family. They knew that caring for these cubs wouldn't be easy, but they were committed to doing whatever was necessary to help them survive. Over the next few days, the family worked tirelessly to care for the cubs. Sarah monitored their health closely, making sure they were eating and drinking enough. Lily, despite her young age, took on the role of helper, feeding the cubs and making sure they were comfortable. The bond between Lily and the cubs grew stronger with each passing day. The cubs, no longer as frightened, began to trust Lily, following her with their eyes as she moved about the cabin. The warmth of the home, the care of her family, and the love Lily gave them helped the cubs recover from their traumatic experience. Despite the comfort and care they were receiving, Sarah and Thomas knew that the cubs could not stay in the cabin forever. The wilderness was their true home, and they needed to return to it eventually. But for now, they were safe, and in that moment, that was enough. The family had made the difficult decision to intervene, to give the cubs a fighting chance at survival, and they would continue to care for them until they were strong enough to return to the wild. As the days turned into weeks, the cubs grew stronger. They began to play, their energy returning as they regained their health. Lily watched them with pride, knowing that her quick thinking and courage had saved their lives. But she also understood that this was just the beginning of their journey. The wilderness was still waiting for them, and one day, when the time was right, the cubs would return to it, stronger and more capable of surviving on their own. For now, though, the family would continue to care for them, knowing that the bond they had formed with the cubs would be one that would last a lifetime. As the days passed and Lily's family settled into their new routine of caring for the bear cubs, they had begun to feel a sense of hope. The cubs, once trembling and weak, were growing stronger every day, their energy returning as they recovered from their terrifying encounter with the wolves. Lily and her parents had worked tirelessly to nurse them back to health, providing them with warmth, food, and love. It had been a challenging but rewarding experience. And while the family knew the cubs couldn't stay forever, they had formed a deep bond with the little creatures. Yet, in the wild, nothing could stay peaceful for long, and life in the wilderness was always unpredictable. One cool morning, just as the sun began to rise over the forest, the family was gathered outside near the cabin, watching the cubs as they played in the yard. Lily, kneeling on the ground, had her eyes focused on the playful antics of the cubs as they tumbled over each other, their fur thickening with each passing day. Thomas stood nearby, watching the cubs with a quiet smile, while Sarah was tending to some plants in the garden. Everything seemed serene, a peaceful moment in the heart of the wilderness. But that calm was about to be shattered. Lily, her senses always attuned to the forest, was the first to notice something was off. She stood up, her eyes scanning the tree line. There, just at the edge of the forest, a massive shape moved through the trees. The bear appeared almost like a shadow in the dense woods, its dark form towering over the surrounding underbrush. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing, a mother bear. And she was enormous. At first, the family thought it might be just another wild bear passing through the area, as bears often roamed the forest in search of food. But there was something different about this one. The bear was not moving casually, it was approaching with purpose. Its gaze fixed on them, and as it came closer, the family noticed something else. There was a large scar across the bear's face, a sign that it had lived through something fierce. The scar was unmistakable, a mark that spoke of past battles fought, of survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. This was not just any bear. This was a mother bear, and it seemed she had come for the cubs. Sarah instinctively stepped back, her hand reaching for Thomas, a silent signal to stay alert. "It's coming closer," she whispered. "Keep calm." Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the bear. He knew how to read the signs of animal behavior. But this was something new. The bear's movements were deliberate, and as it came into full view, it stopped about 10 feet away from them. It stood tall on its hind legs, its massive form casting a shadow over the family. The cubs, sensing the presence of the larger bear, immediately froze, their eyes wide with both fear and recognition. The mother bear's eyes locked onto them, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The family stood still, caught between fear and awe. And then, with a low growl, the massive bear moved toward the cubs. At first, Lily's heart skipped a beat. Was the mother going to attack them? Would she view them as a threat after all the care they had given? But as the bear drew closer, she suddenly lowered her head and nudged one of the cubs gently with her nose. The cubs responded immediately, nuzzling into the safety of their mother's fur. It became clear to the family that this was no ordinary bear, it was their protector. A mother who had come for her cubs. Lily's heart surged with relief. But there was no time to dwell on that. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, more wolves. The pack had returned, their yellow eyes glinting in the sunlight as they crept through the forest. Following the scent of the family, the wolves had circled around, closing in from the other side. The sight of the wolves, once again so near, made Lily's blood run cold. This time, however, there was no hesitation in the air. The family could sense the wolves' growing confidence, as if they knew this time they would not be deterred so easily. But the mother bear, standing tall and steady beside her cubs, made no move to retreat. Instead, she turned toward the wolves, her eyes narrowing, with a growl that was both warning and command. She placed herself between the family and the approaching pack. The wolves paused, clearly uncertain of how to proceed. They were used to hunting alone or in packs. But this was different. The bear was bigger, stronger, and she stood between them and the family she had evidently claimed as her own. For a few tense moments, the wolves hesitated, unsure of whether to advance or retreat. The mother bear, undeterred, stood her ground, her massive body a wall of strength. Her scarred face, a testament to her own survival, glistened in the sun as she took a step forward, her growl rumbling deep from within her chest. The wolves, sensing the danger, began to retreat slowly, their tails lowering in submission. They had learned the hard way that there were some battles worth avoiding. Lily and her parents watched in awe as the wolves, clearly no match for the fierce protection of the bear, slinked back into the shadows of the trees. The mother bear didn't chase them, she simply stood, watching them leave, ensuring they wouldn't dare return. Her eyes then softened as she turned back to her cubs, her protective stance fading into a quiet calm. She had done her job. And now, she stood silently, as if waiting for the family to acknowledge her. Thomas, still speechless from the unexpected turn of events, stepped forward cautiously. He had spent years in the woods and had seen many wild animals. But this was something rare, something profound. The connection between the mother bear and the cubs, the protection she had shown, was undeniable. As a man who had once been a hunter, Thomas had come to understand the balance of nature in a deeper way. And he recognized the importance of preserving life in all its forms. He had given up hunting to become a protector of the wild. And in that moment, it seemed as though the wilderness itself had come full circle to reward him for his decision. "I think she's been watching us," Thomas murmured. "She must have been following us for days, making sure we didn't harm her cubs." Sarah, her eyes wide with realization, nodded slowly. I think you're right. She came to protect them, and us. Lily, standing between her parents, felt a deep sense of gratitude. The bear had not only saved the cubs but had also kept her family safe from danger. It was as if the wilderness had recognized the family's respect for life and had, in return, granted them protection. The mother bear, having ensured that her cubs were safe, turned to leave, her enormous form slipping back into the trees. As she disappeared from view, the family stood still, watching her go. It was a moment of awe, one that none of them would ever forget. In the silence that followed, they realized that this wasn't just about the cubs or the wolves, it was about the interconnectedness of all life. The wilderness had tested them, but the bear had shown him that even in the wildest places, there was always the possibility of protection, of care, and of a bond that transcended the boundaries of species. From that day forward, Lily, her parents, and the cubs knew that the wilderness had its own way of keeping balance. They had been part of something greater than themselves, a story that only nature could tell. The bond they had formed with the bear, a symbol of strength and protection, was a reminder that in the wild, life always found a way to survive, and the family would continue to respect that delicate balance, knowing that the wilderness was not something to be conquered, but something to be cherished and protected. After the intense and unexpected events that had unfolded, Lily and her family knew they had made the right decision to help the bear cubs. But they also understood that their intervention was only a small part of the larger picture. The wild, with all its dangers and unpredictability, was where the cubs truly belonged. As much as they had grown attached to the little creatures and felt a deep connection to them, the family knew they couldn't keep them forever. The wilderness had given the cubs life, and it was the wilderness that would shape their future. So, after careful consideration, they made the decision to take the cubs to a wildlife sanctuary near their home. This sanctuary, dedicated to the rehabilitation and release of wild animals, would provide the cubs with the best chance to adapt and survive in the wild once again. It was a difficult decision, especially for Lily, who had grown so close to the cubs in the time they had spent together. But it was also the right one. The sanctuary would give the cubs the space and the care they needed to prepare for their return to the wild. As they drove to the sanctuary, the family reflected on the lessons they had learned over the past few weeks. The experience had deepened their understanding of the delicate balance between humans and nature. They had always respected the wilderness, but now, they had seen firsthand how fragile that balance could be. The wolves, the mother bear, and the cubs, all were part of a larger system, a web of life that was constantly shifting. The family realized that their role in this system wasn't as simple as being protectors or observers. Sometimes, they had to step in to help, and other times, they had to take a step back and let nature take its course. The relationship between humans and the natural world wasn't always clear-cut. There were times when intervention was necessary, as it had been with the cubs, and times when it was best to let nature run its course, as they had done with the mother bear. This realization was profound for the family, especially for Thomas, who had once been a hunter and had now become a staunch advocate for wildlife. His decision to leave hunting behind had been one of the most significant of his life. But it was also a decision that had given him a new perspective on what it meant to coexist with the wild. He had come to understand that true respect for nature meant understanding its complexities, its beauty, and its dangers, without trying to control it. For Sarah, the veterinarian, the experience had reinforced the importance of compassion and care, but also of knowing when to let go. She had devoted her life to healing animals, but she also knew that part of healing meant preparing them for the challenges they would face once they were returned to the wild. Lily, too, had been changed by what had happened. She had always loved the animals of the forest, but now, she understood the importance of the relationship between all living creatures, how every action, every decision, could affect the delicate balance of life. The cubs had taught her that compassion and courage could make a difference. But that respect for the wild was equally important. At the sanctuary, the cubs were carefully examined and assessed by the staff. They were given the time and space to grow stronger, to learn the skills they would need to survive on their own. The family visited them regularly, watching from a distance as the cubs adjusted to their new surroundings. They saw the cubs become more confident, more independent, as they learned how to forage for food, how to climb trees, and how to navigate the wilderness. It was a slow and steady process, but it was one that filled the family with hope. They knew that the cubs would one day be ready to return to the wild, to find their place in the world that had once seemed so dangerous to them. But they also knew that they had played a small part in helping them get there. Months later, the day came when the cubs were ready to be released back into the forest. The sanctuary had prepared them well, and now, they were strong enough to survive on their own. The family stood at the edge of the woods, watching as the cubs, now larger and more confident, stepped into the trees. They paused for a moment, looking back at the family, as if to thank them for the care they had received. Then, without a sound, they disappeared into the forest, returning to the wild that had always been their home. It was a bittersweet moment for Lily, who had formed such a deep bond with the cubs. But she knew that this was the way it was meant to be. The wild was where they belonged, and it was the place where they would truly thrive. As the family stood there, watching the cubs disappear into the trees, they were reminded of the larger truth that had guided their actions. Nature was a force that could not be controlled, but it was a force that could be respected and protected. The cubs were no longer dependent on them, but they would carry the lessons of their time with the family into the wild. For Lily and her family, the experience had taught them more than they had ever imagined about the interconnectedness of life, the importance of compassion, and the delicate balance that existed between humans and the natural world. The wilderness, once a place of mystery and danger, had become a teacher, showing them how to live in harmony with the creatures that shared the land with them. In the months that followed, the family continued to live in the small cabin at the edge of the forest, finding peace in the rhythms of the wild that surrounded them. They worked together to protect the land, to respect its creatures, and to teach others about the importance of conservation. They understood now that preserving the balance of nature wasn't about domination, but about coexistence. Lily, now older and wiser, took on a new role as a protector of the forest, following in her parents' footsteps and teaching the next generation about the importance of respecting and protecting the wild. She knew that the wilderness was a place of both danger and beauty, a place that required respect, patience, and understanding. And as she looked out at the forest, she understood that the wild would continue to shape them, just as it had shaped the cubs and the mother bear. Life would go on, in all its complexity, and the family would continue to live alongside nature, learning from it and protecting it for generations to come. The story of the cubs, the wolves, and the bear mother would remain with him forever. A reminder of the delicate, unspoken connection between humans and the wilderness. A connection that could never be broken as long as they continued to honor and respect the world around them.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.